The camera goes on.
That's the game. That's okay. Thank you.
All right, I have 5 after 7, so we can go ahead and get started. Anybody who comes late, catch up, and you get the handouts. I have one extra copy. Hi, so my name is Deacon Jason Katz. I'm a deacon at St. Mary's Orthodox Cathedral, the OCA Cathedral in Northeast Minneapolis. I'm one of, we got 7 deacons now. Kind of strange. And then, I don't know if you guys read our biographies, but by day, I'm an engineer at Medtronic. I'm a supply chain quality engineer. Yeah, lived in Fridley with a wife and 4 kids. And that's who I am, yeah. Yeah, so I'm supposed to take attendance, and while we do that, why don't we just go around, and if each of you can introduce yourself, and maybe, given the topic, and I'll explain this here a little more in a minute, it might help if you want to share your background, like what brings you to class. Are you Orthodox? Are you actively converting or seeking, or are you just trying to learn something different? Something like that, and where do you worship?
St. Mary's, Greek. My name is Georgia, and I was born into St. Mary's. I'm still there. We've also been members here at St. George for a number of
also born into the faith. Have grown up in the Twin Cities, so I've been to both St. Mary's and St. George. And again, here to live more.
I'm Brenna. I was baptized Lutheran, and I'm learning and looking to join my family at St. Mary's Greek Orthodox.
I'm Nancy. I was born into the faith, go to St. Mary's Greek Orthodox Church, and was and also Duluth.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Kathy. We attend church at St. Mary's Greek, and I was born in.
I'm Annie Bonmo. Also go to St. Mary's Greek, and I was born in as well.
I'm Parker. I've most recently been attending St. Mary's Greek. I was born Catholic, then raised Lutheran eventually, now preparing for our wedding at the end of September at St. Mary's. So here to learn a little bit more.
Okay, congratulations.
I'm John. I've been attending here at St. George, and I was born into the Catholic faith.
I'm Lyra. I'm attending St. George. My husband John, and I have just a hodgepodge of Christian backgrounds. So I'm looking to
Okay. And for you three who just came, if you want to share who you are and where you come from and where you worship, what your faith background is.
My name is Evangelia, and St. George is our church. I was born in Greece, so I'm born Orthodox. We're just doing, attending class to just learn to learn and slow what works.
My name is Maria. I was born Orthodox. I'm kind of open for religion, well, for any new ones, so just learning all the more stuff, I guess.
I'm Kurt. Just coming to find out all this stuff. I never really had a religion before. I was raised Catholic, but I went to church.
All right, and gentlemen, just your name and where you're from, where you worship.
I'm Eric. I was raised in the Episcopal Church, and our family, we were at St. Paul's on the Hill, having years since actually founding members back in 18 something. Anyway, I admire the high mass that we grew up with, and the formality of the liturgy at the Episcopal Church, and learning about the Orthodox Church, with my fiancé is from the Orthodox Church, and we are planning to have a family, and we want to raise our family in one church, and so we made this choice, so I'm here to learn about the Orthodox practice and about how religion is celebrated in the Orthodox Church.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. This is my last handout.
We have an extra.
Oh, there might be an extra one back there. You guys can share.
So could everybody repeat what they said before they got here?
You guys must have been through this a few times by now, right?
Yeah.
This is just for my benefit. Okay, so again, I'm Deacon Jason Kentz, and the topic tonight is creation, fall, and Messiah, right? Everyone's on board with that? Because that's what we do. So this is an interesting topic and perhaps my favorite, because I think I think this really, really introduces it really exposes people to, or it can expose people to, like the real beauty of patristic thinking in our church. The saints have spilled a lot of ink and perhaps even a fair bit of blood on this topic, you know, on Christology in general, but certainly a lot of ink on this understanding of you know, fall, the creation and redemption, the fall, Messiah, all of these notions, and we tend to have a very linear, really boring understanding of the topic, actually. So this is a real opportunity to bring you guys, you know, just kind of give you just a taste of the breadth of scholastic work that is out there, of theological work that's out there. At the same time, I've also found, I've done this talk a couple times over the last few years, and I found that this also can be a point of frustration, right? That sometimes people come here, I mean, we all come here with our own past and with our own baggage sometimes, and looking to hear very straightforward answers. And the simple fact is that Orthodoxy is very, very clear on just a couple doctrines. One of them, of course, is the Trinity, and the other is the divinity and the humanity of Christ, right? And so our doctrine on that is as crystal clear and as non-negotiable as it can be. But on supporting topics, there's actually a lot of room for discussion, which I find freeing, and some people, a lot of people find freeing, and again, some people find very frustrating. So, for instance, one of the topics that, one of the questions that can come up in this talk is, do we require literal read of Genesis, right? Like, do we require that we take Genesis literally? Is the earth 7,000 years old, or 6,000, or, yeah, it's like 6,000, I don't know, 30 now, I guess. Or what license do we have? Can we believe in evolution, right? And so the irony here is that they sent the scientists to give this talk. So, so I do believe in evolution, and it's challenging. It's challenging to square my scientific knowledge with my faith sometimes in some of the minutiae, but I have no difficulty reconciling my belief in Christ with how I currently understand the world scientifically and how things work. At the same time, there are plenty of people in the Orthodox, and this is common. I'm not the only person in the Orthodox Church that believes in evolution. But other people don't, right? And some people do want to read Genesis rather strictly, rather literally, and that's also fine, right? The church has, for hundreds of years, entertained discussions about how literally we can take Old Testament stories, and particularly the story of the Garden of Eden, and has decided that as long as everything squares at the end of the day with our teachings of Christ, then, and if everything is in support of our teachings of Christ and nothing is detracting from that, then there's room for everybody. So that's hard. Like I said, that's freeing for some, that's a hard message for others. And so some of us may have quite a bit to talk about, or very, very little, depending on you know, where you guys stand with some of these topics. Yeah, so this is really interesting. Another thing, so like I said, this topic, we kind of have a boring read of it. Can someone give me the quick Sunday school 30-second synopsis of what is the fall? What's the fall? What's the story of our salvation?
Disobeyed God.
Who?
Eve, was Adam and Eve.
Okay.
He blamed Eve. The temptation. So that was.
Okay.
No one took responsibility. They blamed each other.
Yeah, okay, so there's this fall, right? Something happened. We eat this apple in the garden. Adam and Eve eat this apple. Eve gets the bad rap. And yeah, they always point to her. Yeah, and so then everything's downhill from there, right? Like, this is just the first pebbles in an avalanche. And, you know, we're in a fallen state. We're in a fallen state, and we're going linearly through time. And then, probably this way. And, you know, and then all of a sudden, Christ comes, right? With the incarnation, the crucifixion, the resurrection. And suddenly things are mended again, and now we're still moving on this linear train of time toward the second coming, right? This is kind of what we all grew up with in Sunday school. That's a very simple, clear way to explain this, and it's not wrong. At the heart, it's not wrong, and it comes from us, from one of our greatest theologians, Saint Athanasius, who wrote a phenomenal work called On the Incarnation. And he really lays this out, right? He lays out this argument, which he calls the divine dilemma. And so he sets up this idea of, man disobeyed God, and now creation's starting to fall apart. And what was God to do, right? This world that he made is starting to fall apart. And so from then on, and so this is, 300, around the Council of Nicaea, for 1,700 years then, we've had this narrative. And he tells it in that narrative fashion, just along with the Old Testament, and it's very, very clear to us who are in the Christian faith, like how this whole story goes together. And so we just teach generation after generation. So that's fine. That's fine. It's a good read. It's very simple. And if you don't push the edges of the conversation, if you're content with everything, then, then I guess you could go home, right? Like that is, at the end of the day, the same story. What I'd like to spend time on instead is talking about how we get there. Because this story, while it's very simple and straightforward to us, and very near and dear to our hearts, is problematic to non-Christians. It's very problematic to non-Christians. And it's actually problematic to Christian kids too, right? When they start reading these, particularly when they read Genesis, and they ask all these really poking, prodding questions. Did Adam and Eve have belly buttons? Or could Adam and Eve get chicken pox? These real questions that are really getting at what is the fall? Is this a real thing? What happened? And so that's what I'd like to spend time on, because you can't, my argument, and it's not just my own, but my hypothesis, my thesis is you can't get to our current belief just by reading the Old Testament straight through and then starting in the New Testament with Mark, or Matthew, or, the Gospels, and just reading. You can't get there. Or you could get there, but you could also not get to the New Testament and be a very happy Jew who is, living a very happy Jewish life with your own way of reconciling your fallen state, right? Jews don't live with this perennial problem of being fallen. They have a mechanism, it's the law. They solved this long before Christ came, in fact. So there's all these difficulties with this very linear read. And so what I really want to spend time on is understanding exactly how we get to where we are now, so that we're not stressed out when one day we're laying awake at 2 a.m. thinking about these silly questions we had as kids that nobody ever took time to answer. And mom and dad just said, go ask the priest, and the priest didn't answer you that day, or, yeah. So that's what I'd like to do. Also in this topic is Messiah. So Messiah is a Hebrew word, and the Greek translation of it is Christ, Christos, and it means the anointed one. It means the anointed one because Jews would anoint their leaders with oil. So Saul was anointed, David was anointed, they would anoint their kings with oil, they'd smear them with oil, and so there's the word Mashiach, Messiah, Christos, the anointed one. And so this is a term. So this is also a very interesting topic, and it's one that I won't do justice to because it's largely philosophical for us as Christians. Because what we have is a very broad idea, expectation of Messiah. And so this is a hot topic of what was expected of a Messiah around the time of Christ. And there were lots of expectations of what a Messiah would be when Christ came. And so some of these expectations are that we would have a kingly Messiah, right? This would be a David Messiah. It would be a new ruler, somebody who would rule in David's place. He would redeem the kingdom of Israel. And so, in fact, in the Hasmonean revolt, 150, 200 years before Christ, when John Hyrcanus and then the Maccabean revolt, there was an uprising in Jerusalem, and for a short period of time, the Jews reclaimed their little kingdom and actually rebuilt the Jewish empire temporarily. And then this is after Alexander's kingdom is split into 4. And then there's a Jewish uprising, and they get their land back for a generation or 2, and then Rome comes in and smashes it to pieces. And so that's, of course, where we enter the scene with the Gospels, right? Is Jerusalem is under Roman law, right? Pontius Pilate is the governor. Herod is a king. He's a Jewish king, but he's not ruling except by permission, right? So that's a weird thing. But so there's an expectation that there would be another uprising, and there would be a political state of Judaism that would be ruled by a king or maybe a priest king. So that's one expectation of a Messiah. Another expectation of a Messiah would have been that this would be a great prophet, perhaps the greatest of the prophets, somebody even greater than John the Baptist. And then even pushing beyond that, there's another expectation that there would be like a Messiah from the line of Aaron, so a priestly Messiah. Which is funny that it got separated, because in Jewish history, the kings were like priest kings. There's a lot more hybridization than I think we can wrap our minds around. Kind of like in Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? Like that priest king when that Nazi dresses up like that. There's a lot of weird stuff going on there, but not so historically inaccurate like they were trying to recreate. That was pretty insightful. So this expectation of a priestly Messiah, so a great high priest that would come, that would be God's chosen one, that would rule, and then God's kingdom would be through the temple, right? And so we've got like temple worship at the core, and creation renewed through the temple, and so a very ritualistic understanding of Messiah. So both of these are kind of in flux. People who are closer to the temple would probably gravitate more toward a priestly Messiah. People who are moving away from the temple, toward what evolves now into our classic forms of Judaism we see now, would have favored something different, or maybe no Messiah at all. There's arguments that the Qumran community, the Dead Sea Scrolls community, maybe even expected 2 Messiahs. So lots of stuff. This was a world in foment. It was really just a cauldron waiting to boil over, and in fact did boil over several times, right? So Christ wasn't the only person crucified for claiming to be the Messiah. There were other people killed. In fact, in the Gospels, or in Acts, I believe they reference other uprisings. And then after Christ, there were other uprisings, including a big one when the temple got destroyed in 70 AD, and then again in 130-ish, 135 AD, when Jerusalem once again rises up against Rome, and then gets totally obliterated, and they rename the city. So this was really a hotbed. And there's scads of writing, and we could talk about this forever, and there's scriptural texts we could look at, and there's extra scriptural texts we could look at. A lot of the writings from the Jewish communities have survived either intact or in fragments, and there's really fascinating stuff. Why we're not going to do that is because of Christ. Because for all the expectations of a Messiah, we have settled on one, right? We have Christ, and we've given him this title. And so discussing what he could have been is only so useful, right? And so it's a fun conversation we can talk about over break, or after class. We can talk more about this, or read on your own, look this up. There's tons of writings on this topic. But what's really fascinating is that Christ breaks the mold. He's not any of those things. He's not a king. He's not a priest. He's not from Aaron's line. He's not. You could argue he was a prophet, but he did, and certainly a teacher. But he did a lot of weird stuff, right? Like he really broke the mold, and so he was always at odds with Jewish leadership. And then what we see is a lot of work in the New Testament writings to try and speak of Jesus in these expectation terms. So, for example, the letter to the Hebrews, the Epistle to the Hebrews. You guys, how many people have read it? The Epistle to the Hebrews. Okay, assignment number 1. So, no, it's great. It's a wonderful work, and one of the main purposes of that whole epistle is to cast Christ in terms of a priestly Messiah, and to explain how Christ is the fulfillment of the priestly Messiah expectation. And the authors it's an uphill battle, because Christ isn't from the line of Aaron, so he's disqualified from the priesthood. And so the author takes this very interesting approach of saying that Christ's priesthood supersedes Aaron's priesthood. Christ is a priest from the order of Melchizedek, right? This priest king of Salem that gets one line called out in Genesis, and he blesses Abraham, right, after the battle of Sodom. And so it's kind of, we think it's an obscure reference, but it turns out there's lots of writings about Melchizedek in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But so this author of this epistle to the Hebrews is trying to explain how Christ's priesthood can exist and can supersede Aaron's priesthood. And so, I mean, it's a little bit of circular logic in there, right? Like, it requires that you believe in Christ to read the letter and accept it. But it's brilliant work, right? And so that's what's going on. Is so they're taking this factual biography of Jesus of Nazareth and retelling it, retelling it with these terms and with these expectations and explaining how we misunderstood before and now we understand clearly. Now the scriptures have been opened to us. Now we understand how Christ can be the priestly Messiah. Peter does the same thing in Acts chapter 2 when he starts talking, and then after Peter, everybody, in all the speeches in Acts, and Paul does the same thing, and then the Gospels with the genealogies connecting Christ to David, right, and showing that Christ is in the line of David. He is the kingly Messiah. We just misunderstood what kingdom meant. It's not a political state. It's the New Jerusalem, the heavenly Jerusalem, the heavenly kingdom. So there's a lot of that. So that really explains a lot of what's happening in New Testament texts with the scriptural proof texting and references. With all of these discussions, it's not so much. Well, what it is it's trying to explain how Jesus of Nazareth has fulfilled many of these expectations. And so so we end up with a little bit of a hybrid, and he, historically, Jesus wasn't the Messiah they expected, right? And ultimately, the ultimate proof of that is that he was crucified, right? Nobody expected the Messiah to be killed as a common criminal, So that's really interesting work. And so for all the expectations of Messiah, we end up with the unexpected, and then we start trying to. Once we confess our belief in him as Messiah, we have to start reinterpreting what Messiah means. So there's a lot of that going on, and like I said, it can really go forever. So moving on to the topic of the day. All right, so I've got some quotes here that I may or may not read. I've certainly put more on here than we'll go over tonight, but we'll kind of use these as little tidbits that'll provoke some thought and lead us along. The first one is from one of the books that you guys, I believe, were all offered, right? One of your books could be Clark Carlton's Faith. Is that right? Is that what you, okay. So he says, many so-called Christians today have relegated the story of Adam and Eve to the realm of religious mythology. It's a quaint story, so they say, but it can have no real bearing on how we as modern scientifically minded people view the world and our place within it. Ironically, the arrogance of such statement testifies to its utter falsehood, for it's the curse of fallen man that he deludes himself into taking the fallen image of things as normal. Well, it is certainly true that Genesis is not history in the modern sense of the world, neither is it simply a story or religious myth. The fall of man is the most real fact of man's life, whether he realizes it or not. So that's a more or less true statement. He's bringing out this idea that that we're bound to the fallen world, right? And he later on discusses science and kind of sees all of scientific study as study of the fallen world, and so therefore it's inappropriate for science to comment on theology, and perhaps vice versa. And to that he has a point, but that doesn't necessarily capture it all, right? There's let's see. Yeah, I mean, really, and Vladimir Lasky, the Russian theologian, a generation or two before Clark Carlton, kind of talks about this idea, right? When the dogma of redemption is treated in isolation, there's always a risk of limiting the tradition by interpreting it exclusively in terms of the work of the Redeemer. Then theological thought develops on 3 lines: original sin, its reparation on the cross, and the appropriation of the saving results of the work of Christ to Christians. And so then that's really where we end up, right? Like that's kind of our Sunday school lesson. The fall, the cross, and how this all plays out. It also leads to this discussion of original sin. And, between Martin Luther, Thomas Aquinas, and really, I mean, from St. Augustine onward, the West has kind of boxed themselves into this repetitive question that gets increasingly philosophical about, first off, what is this idea of original sin? How do we read Romans 5? Did we inherit something in our genes from Adam as descendants of Adam, and what is that, and are we guilty? Are we just tempted like he did? You know, like how does that all make sense? And then the other side of it, the really notorious and nefarious problem that comes up is this hypothetical question that gets asked: is if Eve didn't eat that apple, would Christ have come? Right? And so this rhetorical question gets posed. In fact, Thomas Aquinas, kind of talks about this. This just reoccurring in the West. This idea that what if these what if hypothetical scenarios? What if Adam and Eve didn't sin? Or talk about how do we understand Christ's actions in the Old Testament, and could it have been the Father or the Holy Spirit that was appearing in the burning bush, or with the three boys in the furnace? Some weird hypothetical questions that the Eastern Church, by and large, has just refrained from discussing. We can answer it, we can weigh in on it, but we're not on our best foot at all, because I don't think that the Church Fathers in the early centuries ever wanted to discuss hypotheticals, because they were really struggling enough with what we really believe, right? With these simple questions of, if we believe that this condemned criminal who died on a cross is our Messiah, what does that mean, right? And so we don't even have to ask these hypotheticals about what if he wasn't crucified, or what if Adam and Eve didn't eat an apple. It's hard enough to just make sense of the reality that we've been given, right? And to understand what it means to be God if this is the second person of the Trinity. Callistos Ware is a metropolitan in England. Did you guys get a chance? His book, another one, I suppose, that you could have gotten for this class, The Orthodox Way, and his historical version, The Orthodox Church. Another excellent writer, excellent speaker, makes a comment about original sin that a lot of people have found helpful. The original sin of man, his turning away from God-centeredness to self-centeredness, meant first and foremost that he no longer looked upon the world and other human beings in a Eucharistic way as a sacrament of communion with God. Now that is wholly at odds with anything that you guys would have heard from, like Catholic legalistic doctrine at its finest, right? Thomas Aquinas talked about guilt, and there were some other interesting terms that he uses, to kind of understand this transmission of Adam's sin. And then Callistos Ware just kind of offhandedly makes this comment that, original sin is just turning away from God, right? And we're all guilty of that. So this really is already starting to show how the Orthodox Church can be at odds with a lot of the thinking in the West. And so then, kind of narrowing down to our point, and this is really what we're going to spend the bulk of the time on. Father John Baer, currently the Dean of St. Vladimir Seminary out in New York, wrote a book called The Mystery of Christ, which I'd highly recommend for a read, for a nice Lenten read, since Lent is coming up here in a month or so. That really kind of tackles some of this problematic way of thinking. And so he says, somewhere after his introduction, we should consider again how it is that we speak about the fall. It might sound counterintuitive, but the starting point of the notion of the fall is not the story of Adam and Eve in Genesis. It's not the story of Adam and Eve in Genesis. So, where does it start? I think we'll skip Thomas Aquinas' book. So, I guess what I'd like to do is maybe take a look at the text of Genesis and kind of poke at it a little bit and see how it can be problematic. Has anybody read Genesis like 1 to 3 in the last, year? Anybody? Okay. Good. This will be good then. So most of you haven't. So this will be a nice refresher and easygoing. So why don't we start with the creation story? And can I have a volunteer to read this passage? We'll just read from the bottom of page 4 through the top 2 sentences of page 5. All right. Should I pass the microphone for the benefit of our viewers at home? Yep, that's the one. And God said.
Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have domination over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." Genesis 1:26-28.
All right, thank you. So, to test you guys' memory then, so God starts this passage with, "Let us make man, let us make." How is everything else created in Genesis? Is that the same phrase, let us make the stars, let us make the waters? What does God say in the rest of it? Does anyone remember? That he created. Okay, so like before all this I'm just trying to see. So when God makes light, does he set it out as a plan? What does he say?
Let there be.
Let there be. Let there be light, right? Let there be light. Let there be a vault between the waters and the waters, right? That's a cool way of thinking of the sky, actually. Let there be. So all of creation before man is just this command, and it becomes. And let there be, let there be, let there be. And then he gets to man, and it switches to suddenly there's kind of a plural introduced, let us make. But he says, let us make. And so all of a sudden, something's changed here. It's a different verb. And it makes man a bit of a project, actually, in a way that the rest of creation is not. And this, so this is what the text says, right? And our theologians have long meditated on that point, that man is a project. That the creation of human being, male and female, is something unique, that it's done in a different way, in a special way that's somehow different from the rest of creation. And so then we get our charge, right? So let us make man, and then he blesses us, and he says to us, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over everything, right? So this is the divine charge. So this is the divine command to human beings. This is our calling. This is our vocation, our divine vocation, is to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. And after all this, God rests, and every step along the way, of course, he saw that it was good. So this is creation, God made it, and he made it good, and he was happy with it. And then he makes man, and we're his project in some sense. So we'll skip ahead through the second account of the making of Adam and the making of Eve, and let's see. So does someone want to read this next passage of setting the garden? Perfect.
The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to till it and keep it. And the Lord commanded the man, saying, You may freely eat of every tree in the garden, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day you eat it, you shall die. Genesis 2:15-17.
Okay, thank you. So then, here's the first law, right? The first command given to us. And the command is, do not eat from the tree. Which tree? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? And the consequence if we do? We'll die. The day we eat of it, we will die, right? God is very clear on this point. The day you eat of it, you will die. So there it's set up. There's Adam and Eve in the garden with this tree that, I don't know how they couldn't be tempted by a statement like that, right? What certainly children would be. Don't touch that. Having four, I don't even say that anymore, right? You just don't even mention it. Just put the object away. So anyway, this is the state that's set up in the garden. And so then what happens, of course, the serpent talks to Eve. The serpent, there's no mention of devil here. That comes later. And there's never a disagreement in all of Christianity that the serpent is the devil, but that's not in Genesis. Just to call that out. So the serpent talks to Eve, convinces her she won't die, but she should try this apple. And so she does. She gets to Adam, and then they both eat it. And then there's that great story about, they find out that they realize they're naked and they go hiding. And then this strange scene where God is walking through the garden, calling for them, looking for them, saying, "Where are you?" As if he doesn't know, which is also kind of an interesting idea, right, of a God who might not actually know where they are. Contrast that with Jesus, who can, hear the thoughts and, read the hearts of the Pharisees. A beautiful image, though, a beautiful image of God walking through this garden, looking for these people he cares very deeply about, asking where they are. And so, anyways, then he has to lay down the law. And so the next passage is the consequence. Who wants to read this? Great.
And to Adam he said, "Because you have listened to the voice of your wife, and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth to you. And you shall eat the plants of the field. In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken. You are dust, and to dust you shall return." The man called his wife's name Eve, because she was the mother of all living. And the Lord God made for Adam and for his wife garments of skins, and clothed them. Then the Lord said, "Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. And now, lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life, and eat, and live forever." Therefore the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken. Genesis 3:17-23.
Okay, thank you. All right, so just to recap, what happens to Adam and Eve? What's the consequence?
They're out.
What's that?
They're out.
They're out. They're out. They got kicked out of the garden, right? They're out. Now they have to farm. Now the ground's not going to be nice to them anymore. They're going to have to work hard. Is that the consequence they were expecting? Is that the consequence you were expecting as a reader? I mean, let's be honest, right? Like, just kind of set aside where we're ultimately going, which is, this narrative of creation and fall and redemption that I set forth at the beginning. Just, set that aside and listen to the text. How do we square this with God's threat, right? God said, "The day you eat of it, you will die." And do they die? No, they do not die that day. There's actually, is there even mention of death in this sentence? No. So every generation of theologians, every generation of Christian has had to reconcile this point, right? Of, was the consequence of death delayed somehow, right? And this is kind of a difficult, protracted discussion of how was death introduced here, right? And this is from Paul, right? Through sin came into the world, and by sin, death, right? This connection of sin and death, and here it is. Here's the narrative that we're looking to explain this, and yet it's not here. It's not here in this narrative. In fact, at the risk of sounding impious, I think God comes off sounding like a new parent, right? I mean, I really feel that way. Like I said, I have 4 kids, and I feel this way all the time, so I'm biased. But really, that's a perennial statement that my wife and I make to each other, right? We'll set a harsh consequence, and then of course the kid will do it. And it's like, oh God, we can't ground him for a month. We can't ground him. We can't take away dance class because then they'll be home all night. Why did we say that in the first place, right? Now we have to backpedal and say something that makes sense, right? And so this is a very interesting passage. It's a very interesting narrative. So something happens here. There's no question that somehow the order of things are disrupted. Adam and Eve are all out, right? Yes?
As I have read it, and I've looked back on this passage, I've taken the word guide to mean something more figurative, like the death of innocence, or not literally mean that their heart's not beating, no longer alive, the death of something else, something about their innocence and their purity. That's my they were prior to that initial sin. That they were still alive in body, but something else happened.
Yeah, I think that that's potentially a very good way to read it. And it aligns pretty closely with some of the passages we'll look at from the early saints. Yeah, very much this idea of kind of a death of innocence. Definitely a change moment, like the relationship was destroyed here. So certainly the death of communion, and that's true. But on the other hand, like the word die is the word die, right? I mean, and the fact is that the literal death did not happen. Yeah, so here we are, right? So here we are with this passage that Paul has drawn us back to through Romans and a little bit through Corinthians, and that we continue to go back to as the starting place for the fall in this great Sunday school narrative. And the text does not support this reading. The text that we lean on by itself does not support this reading. In fact, and so then even better, and we don't have time to draw this out slowly and pleasantly, so I'll drag you along. So this is also not a big problematic moment. Adam never comes back in the Old Testament. He gets like one shout out, I think, in 2 Chronicles, in a genealogy or something. Well, he's done. This is it. This is Adam's only mention. So he is not a problem for Old Testament Judaism. A bigger issue is Cain's sin. Right? Cain's sin is a little bit bigger issue. And there seems to be a domino effect all the way down to Noah's generation. But really, that's the moment when it becomes clear that there's a rift. There's maybe stuff going on, and this, like I said, the first pebbles of an avalanche perhaps, but only really when we get to chapter 6 and leading up to the story of Noah, do we realize, do we finally hear in Genesis that God is sorry that he made man, right? And that's a heart-rending passage, that passage in Genesis 6, that God repents that he made us because he saw that the world was full of evil. But only then is it very clear that there's some problematic rift. And then that is patched up with the flood. So there is a break. There's some sort of a break, but then it's mended with the flood, right? And we get the rainbow after the flood story, and God's promise, the covenant of the rainbow, and he spared Noah, and he'll never do that again. He'll never do that again. So within the first 11 chapters of Genesis is a very coherent, full story of creation, destruction, and recreation, and this rending of communion and this mending of communion, and it's very intact, right? This is a very intact thing, and so so this just wasn't the problematic statement for Judaism that Paul sets it up to be for Christians. So what do Jews struggle with, right? So there's still an issue, and later on comes the law, right? And we have the law of Moses. But then again, through the Old Testament, the law is the vehicle of reconciliation. So to clear up the Genesis story, we have the flood and the renewal after the flood, and then longer term in Judaism, we have the giving of the law. Right? We have the Israelites being pulled out of Egypt. Tested in the desert, and then this beautiful giving of the law, and that's the mechanism toward renewal, right? And then the rest of the Old Testament is this constant back and forth of them breaking the law, and then God being mad, and then things being renewed, and a very moving story. But again, there's a logical system at work there that has worked very well for people. So I guess all I'm trying to say is that it wasn't as if before Christ was born, there were a million Jews in Jerusalem wondering, what are we going to do? Right? They didn't walk around with that daily feeling of, I hope I don't die before the Messiah comes, because they don't know what to do. Because they did know what to do. They followed the law. They kept the law. They kept the law. They kept the dietary law. They had temple worship, and then the temple also had its own ritual process of reconciliation. Right? They have the Kippur. Yom Kippur still exists. Right? They still have this Day of Atonement. So again, there's this mechanism for reconciliation and renewal of the covenant that fully existed and that most people were content with. And then this kind of strange expectation of a Messiah was existing side by side with all of that. So how does Paul then latch on to this idea that Adam and Eve fell and that something horrible happened in the garden? Where does he get this idea? Or why does he get this idea? The other reason that this whole discussion becomes important is because we're also trying to avoid, and particularly but particularly Paul, first of all. Paul is our first real theologian who's going to reason out what's going on. He's also trying to avoid another very problematic statement that most of us don't spend enough time thinking about. And that is a statement that Peter makes in Acts chapter 2, verse 23. He says to the Jews gathered at Jerusalem, Christ was delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God. And Peter's very clear about that point, and Paul is very clear about that point internally. And we should all be very clear about that point because the alternative is not appealing. And what is the alternative? The alternative is that the cross was an accident, right? Or if not an accident, a backup plan. And neither of those is appealing. We certainly don't want to believe in a God who didn't expect the garden, and his backup plan then was to send his son and watch his son be crucified for us, right? I mean, that's messed up. It's messed up. It's not, and so Paul is being very careful to try and understand who this Christ is that he met, that he encountered on the road to Damascus, and to not set him up as, our salvation is now plan B, right? Because Adam and Eve blew it, and God didn't expect that, so now he's got to fix it. Although, we'll look at this, Athanasius proposes that, right, with the divine dilemma, what was God to do? Paul is staying away from that discussion because we don't have a clear theology at our core yet, and so he's going to give that to us. And we will look at that. That was actually a pretty good time for a break, I think. So why don't we take 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and regroup and start looking at what Paul does with the Genesis reading, what Paul does in Romans, and then what the saints do following his lead, and start understanding how we built the Christian understanding of fall and redemption that we currently have. It's in addition to. So they have like, what are they, 6? Yeah, like we have the 10. Oh, yeah. But, yes, but it is the law. Yes. Yeah, I'll go over that. Thank you.
She does.
Are you great? 4 years ago. Just moved up. Yeah, flying on the Bedwatch records.
Yeah, it's pretty much. It's on the kind of the opposite side.
Well, sure, yeah, I mean, we're in great compliance. Yep. It is actually.
Yeah, it's up on the hill. It's definitely. Yeah. There's actually no
I wouldn't be there.
No.
Oh, my goodness.
One, third. Fourth.